important thing. And one of the things that I always think about, because I tend to be a little bit more attracted to, say, like biomechanics, is like the idea of like degrees of freedom.
Yes.
And so when you have more range, you have more degrees of freedom to be able to play with and experiment with. And if you look at it from a skill perspective, you look at like the work of, say, like Bernstein, and I always remember that really cool image I think they took of someone like hammering something, like an expert, or a tradesman basically, hammering something. And the arc that they went through each time was slightly different, but the outcome was always the same. So, and to me, expert, or it's not even to me, it's to lots of people, I think, and we always see this, but like what experts are good at is not completing the same movement over and over and over. It's having the ability to get a similar outcome, but being able to manipulate and have variability in that
and
performance.
Complexity in movement. Something we talked about recently. Yeah, absolutely. I
think that's why it's helpful to have more range, is you've got more options in how you move.
Yeah, definitely. I think it depends on the particular task, because like a distance runner is going to be very different to, say, a gymnast.
Yes.
And that's actually probably a good...
that's probably why they can get away with it, because the variability in the type of action they need to create is less.
Yeah.
And the same goes with even, I know I'm jumping around topics here, but like you look at, say, the big spate of osteitis pubis type injuries that we had late 2000s, early 2010s in AFL football populations. And a lot of it, people were suggesting it was heavily related to the drought period in Victoria, and there was, hard grounds. I think that was definitely a factor for sure. But one of the key findings that came out of it is hip range of motion was a big risk factor. And then we've had this now traverse into the world of femoral acetabular impingement, and everyone's like, oh, we've got to check that. And as time's gone on, we found, okay, well, pretty much everyone who's played field sports has, a cam or a pencil lesion. So you could just be cutting everyone open if you wanted to. But range of motion around your hips is important, particularly when you do a sport that is 3D, multidirectional. So if you don't have that, you're probably giving yourself limitations that you don't need. Whereas if you are in a sport like distance running, where you're literally running in a straight line, it's probably not going to limit you as much. And I think thinking about this and how many degrees of freedom you need is probably part of the equation for working out whether it's a deficit or it's not a deficit, or it's going to be a limiter or not a limiter.
Yeah. I actually think it's also worth quickly highlighting too, because you'll often hear this from a lot of distance runners, that there is a correlation between passive stiffness.
Yeah, and this is a big topic. I don't know if we'll get too much of it. You can explain it for people.
Well, I'll explain it very simply, and perhaps we can go into the detail another time. But there is a correlation between passive stiffness and performance in elite distance runners. The issue then is that correlation versus causation. Because what we do know is, and this is when you do things like running, resistance training, any like high intensity physical activity, one of the byproducts you're going to develop is passive stiffness.
Yeah.
And that's actually becomes problematic, we see in a lot of athletes, because it limits their movement capacity. Yeah. And like you were saying before,
when we say passive stiffness, we're talking about like, the common reference you get from people is like, oh, my tissue feels tight, feels sore, it feels limited. Yes. It's that feeling that you get post first few resistance training sessions where you're like DOMs, and then you feel like really stiff in your muscles and you're like, oh, I can't move. That's that feeling of passive stiffness being sort of